next speaker, Sara Wyant, is a Century Farm owner. When I asked her last night at dinner how she would like to be introduced, and we discussed her experience as a veteran farm policy reporter, she said, "No, I'm an Iowa farm girl." And she said she was pleased to have been able to buy her family's Century Farm in 2019. She still keeps her finger on the pulse of food, on farms and rural policy at her website and newsletter, AgriPulse. Get ready for hot topics in the nation's capital with Sara Wyant.
So thank you, Ed, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the People's Company for hosting this conference. It is indeed a pleasure of mine to be back in my home state of Iowa, and not only the place where I started an internship in Des Moines with Wallace's Farmer magazine. Some of you Iowa folks will be familiar with that brand. But also where I was able to launch my career, and now to be the owner of the largest news bureau in Washington, D.C., covering legislative and regulatory issues is quite an honor. So in my short time today, I wanted to try to highlight some topics that are very much in the mainstream for us, but you may not have read about them or had conversations about some of them just because of the nature of the mainstream media and their coverage on agricultural issues, which is primarily lacking in general. So I'm gonna try to tee up just 3 key topics in our time here today. No secret to many of you that Build Back Better has been in the headlines. I wanna just tell you quickly some of the things that are in that for agriculture. It's for all intents and purposes, the $1.7 trillion package is dead because Senator Manchin in a 50-50 Senate is a Democrat who is not willing to go along. He has made it clear, however, that he's open to doing other things in this package. So I'm not gonna be surprised if a scaled down version of it doesn't try to come forward again in 2022. I also want to talk a little bit about freedom to operate issues in general, and you know, it's only 2022, but in 2023 we'll be rewriting a new farm bill. So let's dig into these pretty quickly. Of the 1.7, and again, it won't be that in the final version, but there were some key ag provisions that you should all be aware of. There was $27 billion in new conservation funding in general, and it was divided between a lot of different programs. One that you're probably gonna hear the most about is on cover crops. There was a proposal in here to take $5 billion for a $25 per acre, a $25 per acre program to incentivize cover crop planting. And an additional $5 per acre would be available to incentivize landowners to also encourage their renters, or if you were actually the operator, to go ahead and plant as well. So there are a lot of dollars chasing cover crops right now, and some of those are gonna be coming through perhaps some new programs. Yesterday, Secretary Vilsack was at the Farm Bureau meeting in Atlanta and announced that he's going to incentivize the doubling of cover crop acres through CCC funding. We're at about 15.5, 16 million acres of cover crops right now. And so he'd like to see that get to 30 million by 2030. Not a lot of details at this point on how he plans to do that, but he did promise it would be voluntary and incentive-based. So we're looking at all these plus-ups in conservation that could have some ramifications to the Farm Bill a little later. Cover crops are very complex. It may seem simple to some of you. You just go plant them in the fall, but those of us who are in Iowa understand that it's a lot easier in places south of I-80 than north of I-80. Usually by the time you get the crop off, it can be difficult. This photo that I've had on my slide was of a series we did. It's a 4-part series. It's free on our website, digging into all the policy things that are associated with cover crop planting and some of the problems. Quite frankly, they don't work, excuse me, they don't work in all parts of the country. And our young renter on my Century Farm is pictured here. When he first tried to plant cover crops the very first year, we switched to all no-till. He got out of the field late, so he flew on the cover crops, and then it didn't rain for 3 weeks. So you can kind of imagine what the cover crop look like, which was not much. But in this photo, if you can tell, there's just a little bit of the rye starting to emerge, and he got a really good stand. So I'm excited to see how that's going to work going into 2022. These are where, this is a county by county map that was created by the Senate Ag Committee economist John Newton, and it shows you where cover crops are utilized now, blue being the most density. And we've got quite a bit of a great story to tell in terms of farmers' willingness to plant cover crops. But you can see that there's some parts of the country, especially those where if we're going to grow anything, we probably need to irrigate, or we need to, have land go fallow in some years. This is really problematic because, wheat growers, especially winter wheat, they consider themselves a cover crop, right? But if they harvest it in the spring, it's not eligible for any incentives. So the policy is really lagging what is out there in the technology. And then we've got new crops coming on. You probably heard a little bit about camelina or pennycress, which is it can be harvested for oil seed and for animal feed. And so as we get to these new enhancements in cover crop technology, we really don't have programs that recognize how that they could work in terms of protecting the ground over the winter. There's also some interesting language in Build Back Better. Again, we're not sure what's going to be in the final package. We're just going to be keeping our tabs on it. But the Biden administration asked the airline companies in this country to achieve a 20% reduction in emissions by 2030. And they wanted a tax credit. Well, it was in the House version to give them an additional incentive for using sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. They've pledged to use it. We're talking a small portion here, $3 billion, and they're using more like $18.3 billion in conventional fuel. But you can see this photo of an airline here. United flew from Chicago, their headquarters, into Washington, D.C., had a big press conference touting how they flew in. One engine was using sustainable aviation fuel. And so this demand for that is creating some new market dynamics that are really interesting. And I think we're going to be watching to see how it shapes out, what feedstocks are going to be eligible for the different sustainable aviation fuel, and what's going to qualify for tax incentives. So something for you all to watch. This is a podcast we did with Dan Bossi. He's with Ag Resources. Some of you probably know him. Maybe you've spoken here before. But Dan is a great economist. And it wasn't too long ago, like 2019, he was talking to me about, hey, do you think we could get 40 million acres set aside in the CRP? Because it looks really kind of rough. Now Dan is talking about peak farmland. He's saying that we need to have another 40 million acres of soybean to meet demand for renewable diesel and sustainable aviation fuel. So these are the kinds of things that are, kind of starting to bubble up in the marketplace that we're hearing about. And for the most part, lawmakers aren't paying a lot of attention. Major companies are. They're building processing facilities, and they're trying to catch up with this strong demand for these new fuels that are addressing, again, a very important priority for the Biden administration, and that is climate change. So how this is going to play out in the policy angle is something that we're going to keep an eye on. We also know that this has the potential to create another food versus fuel debate. Some of you may remember the run-up to that. I know, Mike, you obviously have been involved in this, where you've got major food companies complaining that biofuels are really mucking with their ability to get key ingredients. So we had this last week with the Bakers Association, the Pet Food Institute, the Snack Food Association. They approached us about running an opinion piece, and we have opinions on our website as well, where major people that want to talk to lawmakers and associations will write and submit those to us. So they submitted this piece talking about we need to rethink the renewable fuel standard, because they are very, very concerned about their ability to source vegetable oil, and primarily soybean oil. Now, Steve Sunsky, the CEO of the American Soybean Association, wrote a rebuttal the very next day. You can find them both on our site. But the word is that this is rumbling up, and it is likely to continue to echo on Capitol Hill as more and more companies speak out about what is happening on soybean demand. One of the other topics is on freedom to operate. I'm not so much concerned because I know we have great leadership here in the state of Iowa, but this is one of the reasons why we opened a Sacramento office almost 4 years ago. And that is because what happens in California and really West Coast writ large often comes back to haunt the rest of us in agriculture. We're seeing it right now with Prop 12, which the state of California has defined what an animal has to have for space in order to be raised and then later processed and consumed for consumption in the state of California. You know, you might have seen the headlines. It's been about Bacongate and some other things that people have been talking about. The bottom line is it raises prices for everybody, right? In some places, you're going to have more space for a farrowing sow than you are in an apartment in New York City. It's really, really ironic, but these are the kinds of rules and regulations that are making it more difficult to farm, even when we have such great technology. We have innovators, the Harry Stein, I mean, I can go on and on with the great names in Iowa and beyond. We have people who are doing great things to produce more food with less inputs. But they have to be approved, and then they go through the federal level. And so you've got like some wonderful crop protection products that are in the pipeline. It could take 5 to 7 years to get through EPA, and then another 3 to 5 years through California's Department of Pesticide Regulation. Now, I don't know about you, but as an investor, I think I'd like to see a little bit more faster turnaround on something that I'm investing to bring to market. And so these freedom to operate issues are of concern, and I think we have to keep an eye on them. As I mentioned, California, Oregon, and Washington are coming up with a lot of new things. One of them in California most recently is that they want to have a new statewide notification system. And they are thinking about 72 hours in advance of when you would want to spray any crop protection chemical or apply fertilizer, that you would have to go into a notification system for anybody to see. Now, I don't know about you, but I do know quite a few lawyers that are watching these sorts of things and putting together the map. There's the data of application. Here's the data of somebody who had, whatever health issue. And you see those sorts of things that are putting together some of these major lawsuits. Now, I'd like to think that's not the case, but we hear of many instances of like this. And I know some California farmers that are trying to go out at night and spray crop protection chemicals because they don't want some activist group videotaping them in trying to make a case that they're doing something wrong. So they're concerning. They're not anything that's going to be, I think, stopping American agriculture from its growth, but we do have these innovative new technologies that hopefully will be allowed to come to market, and we won't stop killing off all the other things that have been used historically. We've already gotten rid of chlorpyrifos now. Dicamba is at risk. So we're watching these issues quite carefully. I know you're going to talk a lot more about carbon markets throughout the day, and I just want to share some research we did. This is nationwide research that we were working with Aimpoint out of Ohio. It was conducted last fall, and I think most of the research that we see really goes to show that landowners and farmers are very, very interested in embracing ag and carbon markets and the potential, but there's also a real need for more education. For example, in this research question, we had about 30% who said they are already actively doing something. But then you've got others that are considering, and about a third who said they just need to understand what's the value equation. We also found out that the programs that are out right now are not lucrative enough to really get people into the ball game. So you can see in this middle bar chart here that about 60%, a little over, said that they would need at least $40 an acre in terms of an incentive payment in order to look at carbon and implement more carbon sequestration practices and participate possibly in markets. And I think that's the low end. I think you're going to see 40, 50, 60, eventually as these things develop. So there's a strong interest, but again, they need more education and they'd like more incentives. They see soil integrity as being very, very key as farmers that I work with all across the country, excuse me, they are very, very observant of soil health and the practices that can help enhance that, especially as they see these wild weather events. I think they're very, very open to it. But they also want to understand how they're going to pay for it. Now, I talked about Build Back Better, $25 per acre might go towards that and be a nice incentive. But we also know as these programs get developed, there's going to be more and more demand for cover crop seed. Prices are going up. We know where prices are going up on everything else on the farm too, right? Fertilizer, crop protection chemicals, machinery, everything is going up. Interest rates likely to go up. So as you look at this whole portfolio of things, I think programs or incentives that can help reduce that risk of adopting some of these measures that will sequester more carbon are going to be really, really key to watch. Last, I want to talk to you just a little bit about a farm bill. I don't know if any of you have been active. We work with a lot of different associations, whether it's the corn growers or the farm bureaus or the Western growers. There's a lot of different folks that are very interested to see how this is going to shape out. Under the current Congress, I think there's an anticipation that you might see a carbon title in a new farm bill, or at least a lot of carbon provisions that are going to be included in the conservation title. However, we know that so much of what we're talking about right now is really set up for the midterm elections, right? So as we look at this fall coming ahead, there's strong probability that the House will flip to Republican control. And so instead of chairman of the Ag Committee on the House side right now, who's Mr. David Scott from Georgia, you'll see G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania as the likely chair if that happens. You also could see a lot of other things that, depending on how the Senate might change. I think it's less likely that there will be a flip in the majority in the Senate, but you've got Debbie Stabenow, who hails from the great state of Michigan. She's the current chairman. She's been around for a long time on the Ag Committee, does a great job, knows these issues, knows how to work them, and she's also in Democratic leadership. On the minority side, you have John Bozeman from Arkansas. Again, a great guy, a lot of experience. So it'll be up to them to see if they can work together on trying to craft something that will, and historically the Ag Committees have worked on a bipartisan basis. Right now, there's not much of that going on anywhere. So we have to be cognizant of that, because normally the Farm Bill would be broken up by geographic sort of issues, not so much political issues, but this time around it feels like we're going into a little different cycle. So we've heard that the committees will start with hearings as soon as this spring. I don't think it's going to be February, but maybe March. We've got a big event in DC, kind of laying the groundwork for the next Farm Bill, and that's right next to National Ag Day. So we're going to be talking about this and trying to bring up some of these ways that policy can better reflect reality, even though it lags generally. We want to see if some of the new technologies that are being produced can actually be incorporated into some of these policies. For example, we've seen some new innovations happening in crop insurance. They just announced this new PACE program, which is going to help better insure the risk with split nitrogen applications. We've got a company based here in Des Moines, Pivot Bio, who's doing some really unique stuff with nutrients. Are those products going to be eligible for some of these conservation programs, which can reduce the amount of fertilizer that's required? So those sorts of discussions are taking place. Also on CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, as many of you know, that's got about 21 million acres still in it. Secretary Vilsack has pledged at the start of his return to USDA to really bump that amount by several million acres, but it's a tough task, right? There's all these market demand factors. Everybody wants Iowa farmland, everybody wants to buy farmland, but you've got an administration still says we should be retiring it. Well, some folks are starting to say maybe instead of getting into this bidding war to try to get more high quality land in, we ought to have the bidding war for the most marginal farmland. Originally, that's what it was. There was an environmental benefit index that you had to meet these requirements, but it's been changed several times. And so people will be looking at changing the incentives potentially on CRP. They're looking at the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which now, I don't know about if any of you have tried to apply. There's a huge backlog for cost share that can help implement conservation practices. I know most people I talk to are a couple years back. And so all of these things are driving a lot of different things that we're going to continue to watch for you, to be your nation, to be your eyes and ears on Capitol Hill as we talk to people, ask those questions that can be important to American agriculture. And then we're also going to hopefully play a role in educating. And this is where I would highly encourage you to do so as well. You know, when I grew up, my dad would bring our congressman, some of you might remember Jim Leach, he was the first one I met, but we would bring them out to the farm and talk to them about the issues that were important to us and things that were going on. And my dad never stopped doing that, and it was a good early lesson to me to be ever vigilant about understanding the issues and also about explaining them to people, because some of the committees now, especially on the House side, there are a lot of new members, and some of them have no idea about what happens on a farm. Some of them are on the committee because of nutrition issues. Bobby Rush, who's going to be retiring, was from urban, Chicago, downtown Chicago. He's on the Ag Committee now. We've got a lot of members who are very new to this policy setting discussion. And when we go through the midterms, that's going to happen again. So there's a lot of opportunity for you to all be involved. I think that one of the things that I just want to close with here is that as much as we know that there's a lot more money in agriculture going into this year, there's also a lot more uncertainty. And part of that, as this chart shows, is that there has just been so much government funding that's been pumped into agriculture. And during the pandemic, we saw the great need. We saw how people needed to help and try to ease these supply chain disruptions. But now as people look at, hey, prices are really good, right? Yeah, but so are all my input costs. There's this uncertainty going forward because the expectation is that government funding will not be there at the level it has been in the past. So how you navigate those will be key. Again, we're going to be watching it very, very closely. And if you want to follow us, please do. We'd be happy to have you. Check out our website. And I look forward to visiting with you during the rest of this conference. Thank you so much.